In the very early morning on August 31st, 1888, 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly Nichols, was seen leaving the Ye Frying Pan pub at around 12:30. She headed to the kitchen of her lodging house around 2 a.m. Her lodging house keeper asked her for the 4 pence she owed for a bed that night. She did not have the money, and she earned the money 3 times that night, but drank it away in the pub every time. Polly was kicked out until she could come up with the money. Polly pointed at her new bonnet she got earlier and said, "I will soon get my DOS money." Polly was a sex worker and was confident she could still earn the 4 pence that night. Emily Holland was the last person to see Polly alive that night, besides her killer. At 2:30, she saw Polly visibly drunk and tried to get her to come back to the DOS house. Polly declined, stating, "I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I have spent it." At approximately 3:40 a.m., while walking on Bucks Row on his way to work, cartman Charles Allen Cross saw what he thought was a tarp laying in the road. It turned out to be the body of a woman. She was laying on her back, holding onto the gate with her eyes open and her skirt raised. Charles bent down to investigate. Another man, Robert Paul, arrived shortly after. Cross touched her face. It was warm, but her hands were cold. The two men discussed whether she was dead or alive, and they both went to find a policeman, leaving the woman after pulling her skirt down. Shortly after, Police Constable John Neal discovered the scene. Upon closer examination, it became clear that the woman was dead. Her throat had been cut, deeply, twice, nearly decapitating her. She was still warm, indicating that she had been killed only minutes before she was discovered. At the corner of Hanbury Street and Baker Row, Cross and Paul found Police Constable Jonas Mizzen. They told the officer about the body in Bucks Row. Cross explained that he believed the woman was dead. The two men were both allowed to continue on to work. Dr. Llewellyn was called for, and he performed a post-mortem. He estimated the murder occurred about 30 minutes before the body was discovered, and that the knife used was likely a long, strong blade with a sharp edge. Her throat had been cut from left to right, severing the arteries. Her body was moved to the mortuary, where more wounds were found. Her abdomen had been slashed, and there were deep wounds across her lower abdomen, bruising on the face, and her privates had been stabbed. Dr. Llewellyn believed the wounds were made with the same knife in a downward thrusting manner, and he believed that the killer had some anatomical knowledge. The wounds took 4 to 5 minutes to inflict. He noted the little amount of blood at the scene and believed the mutilations were made after she was dead. She was identified later that day. The body was that of Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly Nichols. Word spread throughout the East End of London. Newspapers across London reported on the murder, describing it as horrible and ghastly. The public believed it was a Jewish man known as Leather Apron. The police had no real evidence to find the killer. Nothing was left behind at the scene, and no one witnessed the murder. The night of September 7, 1888, 47-year-old Annie Chapman was at her lodging house on 35 Dorset Street. She had been staying there for a few weeks already, but she did not have the 4 pence to pay for a bed that night. Timothy Donovan, the DOS housekeeper, told Annie she couldn't stay unless she paid the 4p. Annie was a sex worker, and she said she would go earn the money and then return shortly. 1:35 a.m., she arrived back at the lodging house with a baked potato, ate it, and then left. She told the night watchman, "I won't be long, Brummy. See that Tim keeps the bed for me." Annie was last seen at 5:30 a.m., September 8th, by Elizabeth Long. She reported that she saw Annie talking to a man outside 29 Hanbury Street. She described the man as dark-haired, over 40, slightly taller than Annie, a foreign, shabby, genteel appearance, and wearing a deerstalker hat and a dark coat. While walking by, she overheard the man say, "Will you?" Annie responded, "Yes." At about 5:15 a.m., a man who lived at 27 Hanbury Street went out the back door to the outhouse. He heard a woman say,
"Oh no!"
and then he heard the sound of something or someone falling against the fence between the backyards of 27 and 29 Hanbury Street. At 6 a.m., John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, discovered Annie Chapman's body in the backyard. Her body was laying on the ground near the steps, her head towards the building, and her dress pulled up her waist, exposing her lower body. The police were called, as well as Dr. George Phillips. Her throat had been slashed twice from left to right, nearly severing her head from her body. Her abdomen had been cut open, with parts of her insides placed over her shoulder. Her uterus was removed, and part of her bladder. The killer had taken them from the scene. Blood spatter was found on the wall in 6 areas, up to 1.5 feet above the ground. 2 pills that had been prescribed to Annie were found by the body, along with part of a torn envelope, a piece of muslin cotton fabric, and a comb. Police also found a leather apron and a dish of water by the spigot. A handkerchief was found around her neck. Police believed that she was choked until her death before she was mutilated. It was believed that the killer had some anatomical knowledge to remove the uterus and bladder. The killer might be a doctor or someone with surgical experience. She had died at or before 4:30 a.m. Little evidence was found at the scene to find the killer. There were many people present in the surrounding homes, but very few had seen or heard anything. Locals took advantage of the situation to earn money from the members of the crowd surrounding the sealed-off crime scene at 29 Hanbury, and let them in to view the crime scene from their windows overlooking the scene. The media took the information about the leather apron and went wild. The leather apron belonged to John Richardson. The apron was left by his mother, who had washed it on September 6th. It had nothing to do with the crime scene. John was questioned by police, but was eliminated as a suspect. John Pizer was a shoemaker with the nickname Leather Apron. He was known to intimidate local sex workers with a knife. He was arrested September 10th, but he was released after his alibi was verified for both of the murders. A letter was received by the Central News Agency in London on September 27, 1888. It was addressed to the boss. They gave it to Scotland Yard to investigate the contents. It reads, "Dear boss, I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do shall clip the lady's ears off and send them to the police, just for a jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work. Then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before. I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha! This was the first time the famous name Jack the Ripper was given. The letter was taken seriously at the time, but many believe now that the letter was written by a journalist to boost newspaper sales. But some still believe it was the killer due to the specific injuries he would inflict on his next victim that was written in the letter. On September 29, 1888, 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride was seen in various places with multiple men. Around 11 p.m., she was seen leaving the Bricklayers Arms pub on Settle Street. Then close to Brenner Street, she was seen with a man in a morning suit and a bowler hat. He was short with a dark mustache. At 11:45, she was seen with a well-dressed man with a coat, dark pants, and a peaked cap. They were at 58 Brenner Street. The two were kissing on the street. At 12:35, Police Constable William Smith was walking his beat. He passed Elizabeth, who was with a man, at 40 Burner. He had a felt hat and was holding a long package. At 12:45, a dock worker saw her with a man in a long black coat. He heard Elizabeth say, "No, not tonight, some other night." At 1 a.m., Louis Dean Schultz, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club located at 40 Berner Street, turned his horse-drawn cart into Duffield's yard. His horse shied away to the left. Something was in the way, a dark object. He got off the horse and lit a match. He found the body of Elizabeth Stride. Blood was still flowing from her neck and her body was still warm. The crime had just happened. The police were called for. Frederick Blackwell and police surgeon George Phillips arrived at the scene. She had a torn handkerchief around her neck. It is believed that the killer took her to the ground and then used the handkerchief to cut off her airway, then from left to right cut her throat, cutting the handkerchief in the process. Her chest was bruised, so they believe that the killer pinned her down during the struggle. It's believed that when Dean Schultz entered the yard with his cart, the murder was taking place. The killer quickly hid in the shadows after hearing the cart, since it was very dark in the yard, so he could avoid being seen. Blood was still pouring out of Elizabeth's neck when Dean Schultz lit the match. He most likely surprised the killer, who did not have enough time to mutilate the body. Israel Schwartz reported that he saw Elizabeth outside the club being assaulted by a man who was 5'5", had a fair complexion, and was wearing a dark jacket and peaked cap. At 12:45, he saw the man try to drag her to the ground and then push her down. Another man exited the building and lit his pipe. The man assaulting Elizabeth shouted, "Lipsky!" Israel left the area without stopping the altercation. It is very likely that one or more people saw the killer that night, but there was again little evidence for police to follow up on. But that same night, under an hour later, another, more horrifying crime scene would be found. Catherine Eddowes lived with John Kelly, a fruit salesman in Whitechapel. She lived a rough life and took to drink, and she was an occasional sex worker. Early on September 29th, 46-year-old Catherine told John that she was going to travel to borrow money from her daughter. At 8 p.m., John went to the Doss house and stayed the whole night. At 8:30, Catherine was arrested for public intoxication by 2 police constables until she sobered up. She was unable to stand. She was held for a few hours and then released at 1 a.m. Instead of heading home, she headed towards Mitre Square. Joseph Lawend, Joseph Levy, and Harry Harris saw Catherine at 1:35 a.m. She was talking to a man at the entrance to Church Passage, which led to Mitre Square. The man was around 30 years old, average height, had a fair complexion, and a mustache. He was wearing a reddish neckerchief, a grayish jacket, and a peaked cap. Catherine had her hand on the man's chest as the 3 men walked by. This was the last time she was seen alive. Police Constable Edward Watkins passed through Mitre Square at around 1:30. He saw nothing and continued on his beat, which took him through Mitre Square every 14 minutes. At 1:44, he returned to Mitre Square. In the southwest corner, he spotted the body of Catherine Eddowes, just 45 minutes after the body of Elizabeth Stride was discovered. After finding the body, Watkins blew his whistle and went to get the night watchman of a nearby building, who was an ex-police constable, George Morrison. Surgeon George Sequeira arrived on the scene at 1:55. Shortly later, police surgeon Frederick Brown. Her throat had been slashed very deep. A handkerchief was also found around her neck, just like the previous victims. Her nose was sliced, her cheeks slashed, and her eyelids cut. A V shape was cut onto her forehead, and cuts went across her face. Her abdomen was cut open. Her insides had been pulled out and put deliberately over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and part of her uterus were removed and taken from the scene. More cuts were found on her private area and thighs. The murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes are known as the double event. It's believed that the killer did not have enough time to mutilate Elizabeth before being interrupted, so he found another victim, Catherine, and inflicted some of the worst injuries yet out of all the victims. At 12:55 a.m., Police Constable Alfred Long was walking his beat when he reached a stairway, Golston Street. He found a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron covered in blood and feces. He passed the stairs at 2:20 and had seen nothing. Above the apron was graffiti written in chalk. It said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Metropolitan Police Commissioner Charles Warren ordered the graffiti washed off, fearing anti-Semitism riots. The City of London police wanted to photograph the graffiti, but they were forced to wash it off. Major Henry Smith, acting commissioner of the city police, claimed that he discovered bloody water in a public sink off Dorset Street. The killer had yet again escaped without leaving any evidence that led back to him. News spread fast throughout Whitechapel about the double murders. Jack the Ripper had struck again. But yet again, there would be an even more horrific, more brutal, and more bloody murder. At 25 years old, Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest Ripper victim. She was an attractive young woman who lived in a one-room apartment at 13 Miller Court. Rent was 4 shillings 6 pence. The room was 12 by 12 foot. She lived there with Joseph Barnett, but after he lost his job, Kelly started working as a sex worker. Joseph got mad that Kelly continued to bring other sex workers over to stay the night. The pair got into a fight over this, and Joseph moved out. The window next to her door was broken. Neighbors said this happened when Mary was drunk one night, and she used the broken window to unlock and lock her door after she lost her key. A coat was used to block the window. On September 8, 1888, Kelly was spotted at 10 Bells Public House. Later, she was seen at the Horn of Plenty pub. At 11:45 p.m., Mary Ann Cox, another resident in Miller Court, saw Mary Jane Kelly return home drunk with a suitor. The man was stout, red-haired, and about 36 years old. He wore a black bowler hat, a thick mustache, skin blotches, and he was holding a beer can. Kelly was heard singing that night when Mary Cox left her apartment at 12, and at 1 she was still singing. At 2 a.m., an acquaintance of Mary Kelly, George Hutchinson, saw Mary at Flower and Dean Street. Kelly asked him if he could give her 6 pence, but he said that he was broke. Mary continued walking down the street when she was approached by a Jewish man in his mid-30s. He was well dressed, had a pale complexion, a small mustache, and he was carrying a small parcel. Hutchinson walked towards the pair and was suspicious of him. It appeared that Kelly knew him, but he was well dressed for the neighborhood, and he seemed out of place. As Hutchinson approached, the man very obviously pulled down his head and hat to cover his eyes as he passed by. Kelly said, "All right, my dear, come along, you will be comfortable." Hutchinson followed behind the pair as they walked to 13 Miller's Court. He waited outside until 2:45, then continued on his way, not seeing Kelly or the man again that night. Mary Ann Cox returned to her apartment at 3 a.m., but saw or heard nothing until 5:45 a.m., when she heard someone leave Kelly's apartment. Elizabeth Parker lived right above Mary. Her cat woke her up that night, and she heard someone cry out, "Murder," between 3:30 and 4 a.m. At 5:30, she left and went to the 10 Bells pub. She saw nothing suspicious. At 10:45 a.m. on November 9th, Thomas Boyer was an assistant to Mary Kelly's landlord, John McCarthy. He had been sent to collect Mary Kelly's rent. Her rent was overdue, and she owed 29 shillings. He knocked but received no answer. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. He then looked through the broken window pane by the door into Kelly's room. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mary Kelly's mutilated body was laying on the bed, and the room was covered in blood. He ran as fast as he could to get the landlord, who verified the horrifying sight. Bauer was sent to get the police. Walter Beck came to the scene. He blocked off the court, requested help from Scotland Yard, sent for bloodhounds, and Surgeon George Phillips. News spread fast, and over 1,000 people were on the streets outside. At 1:30, the door was broken into by police. Mary Jane Kelly's murder was by far the most brutal and savage out of all the Ripper murders. 2 crime scene photos were taken, and Kelly's body was taken from the scene. Her face was so mutilated that Joseph Barnett could barely identify the body. Her wounds were horrific, and the list is extremely long, but in short, the throat had been slashed down to the spine. Her face was so mutilated that it was unrecognizable. Her nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears had been partially removed. Her abdomen was open with the contents spread around the room. Her thighs had been flayed down to the bone. Her breasts were removed down to the rib. Her heart was removed and taken from the scene by the killer. The list goes on. The fact that the killer was not rushed and had a private residence resulted in what some call the killer's masterpiece. He took his time and did what he couldn't do out in the open like in the previous murders. Thomas Bond wrote in his report, "In each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer or a person accustomed to cutting up dead animals." A very different opinion to the other surgeons and doctors who claimed that the killer did have anatomical knowledge. The police conducted house-to-house searches and interviews, but got no real leads that led to the killer's identity. Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, offered a pardon for any accomplice not being a person who contrived or actually committed the murder, who shall give such information and evidence as shall lead to the discovery and conviction of the person or persons who committed the murder. But no one came forward, and no one was ever charged for any of the murders. Stay tuned for the next video, where we go over the potential murderers. The list is long over the past 135 years. The 136th anniversary for the first confirmed Ripper murder of Polly Nichols is on August 31st, 2024. Thank you all for watching, folks. This has been, by far, one of the stories I've been most interested in since I was a kid. There is so much information about the Ripper murders, and even more potential victims, other than the conical 5 we discussed today. I will see you on the next one, folks. I hope you enjoyed. Peace.